Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Legal Insights webinar series. My name is Nihal Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy Law Firm, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Today's session is a movement sideways on the focus of the legal compliance obligations on the new workplace risk assessments for COVID safety. We are obviously, and like many other agencies, many people are tired of the COVID safety requirements, but it is something from a legal insights that we are just going to revisit. We have had a huge number of agencies just jump in and also ask us to repeat this session and also build on some of the questions that they actually raised last week. What we are seeing is a shift in terms of the rules for COVID safety right around the country. We're going to review some of these, but also the shift back onto each of your agencies in relation to work health and safety obligations. Next week, we are going to pick up some of the governance reporting requirements again, and also look at the new requirements, particularly under the financial reporting and also partnership obligations that agencies do need to consider. So when we're talking of the COVID safety and workplace risk assessments, what do we actually mean? Well, what we're finding is that there has been a shift and there is now a movement across pretty much all state and territory governments from their emergency or pandemic legislation back onto the work health and safety rules. What this means is that as the rules and COVID safety rules are easing around the different states and territories, essentially this responsibility of ongoing management is now being pushed onto each of your agencies. One of the most apparent ways that this is actually being done is through what we call a risk assessment, where essentially agencies are expected to manage their COVID requirements, particularly for personnel around vaccinations and who can be vaccinated versus who should actually be stood. I'll be careful in how I say this, not stood down, but essentially asked not to come into work because they are COVID positive as well too. So from an HR perspective, we are finding that there's a lot of discussions, particularly in the HR space as well too, especially where this actually overlaps. We do have a range of tools and resources that are also available to you. I will just jump in and show you where those are. But before I do that, as always, we pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands in which we all meet. While the session is being run by webinar and recorded, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So what are we going to give you at the end of today's session? Essentially, you will have a COVID risk assessment document. You will also have a vaccination policy document as well too. Hopefully by attending this, you'll be able to avoid penalties and meet your work health and safety obligations as well too. You do all have access to the Gemba 360 legal resources as well too, where all of these information that I am talking about, including today's webinar slides, are also placed. So how do you get there? Well, you can go into our website. You will find that you can also jump in to the Gemba 360 website. It is a link, but you can go to gemba360.com. You will be taken to this circle. This is a resource that is open for all attendees to jump in and use. Our staff will give you a call today after today's webinar to make sure that you can actually log in and access these resources. So when you log in, you will see a screen that looks like this. Now, where we are going to actually load the information in, we will place it into what we call the Gemba Docs area, and you will find these located in the what we call the Policy and Procedures Register. So if I click on Gemba Docs, this screen will open up. I can have a look at the Policies and Procedures document, and you can see that we've got the information here. Now, the document that I'm going to refer you to is essentially this document that we have. And let me bring this up to actually show you this document. It is a work instruction document. Here we are here. And essentially it has the list of information in, it has the tables, it is a Word document. and it also has the risk assessment tool that you can actually print out and also use for your agency. And we're going to walk you through this document today. You'll also find that we also have, if I bring this down, it says agency risk assessment tool. You can simply, it is a Word document. You can simply search and replace and instantly have access to this for your agency to be able to use it as well. So it is a document that is there for your agency to be able to use. So if we go back to the recommendations, it is the COVID risk assessment that we're going to talk about. There is also a vaccination policy document that sits alongside of this, again, that you can use as a template. Next week, we will be going into what we call a 12-month roadmap in terms of your compliance obligations, and it will start the sessions for your agency to be able to access. So let's have a look. The workplace risk assessment that we're talking about here essentially is this document here. Now, what we are finding on this is that a lot of departments of health are asking agencies to do a risk assessment for their COVIDSafe. But what does this actually mean and how do you actually use it? Well, we're going to step you through this. First of all, let's have a brief overview of what the laws are. Now, as always, if you do have any questions, you can ask us these. Just simply type these into the chat bar and we will come to this. But essentially, from October 2022, National Cabinet has announced changes to isolation requirements for positive COVID-19 cases. This means that those that have COVID symptoms are encouraged to stay home while they remain unwell, but it will no longer be mandated for positive cases to remain in isolation for 5 days. In different states, there are different rules, however, in saying this. But essentially what we are seeing, if you look at Tasmania, is that effective from the 1st of July, there are no longer requirements under the Public Health Act for any workers to be vaccinated, and Public Health continues to be strongly recommended that all eligible Tasmanians stay up to date with their vaccinations. What you will find, though, is that there is a reasonable measure to implement based on the workplace's COVID-19 risk assessment. And you'll find this phrase being repeated in other states and territories. However, there is the catch-all, of course, for high-risk settings, and that's particularly covering vulnerable population groups as well too, which really includes people that are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent, people that are working elderly or aged care or NDIS services, all of which are considered to still be high-risk settings. Now, when they talk of choosing requirements for vaccination for employees, what again we see, for example, just in Tassie, and I'll just jump around the different states as well too, I can see a few questions coming up, is that as for all work health and safety requirements, workplaces must ensure that any vaccination requirements they choose to implement are based on risk assessments and lawful and reasonable in the circumstances. So we're seeing a big push by government agencies back onto your agencies. So how does this work and what do you need to look at? Well, if we compare what's happening in Tassie to other states as well too, like Victoria, again, you'll see that in other states like Victoria, again, from the 13th of October, there are different categories. In this case, A, B, and C health workers are required to be fully vaccinated if they are under 18 years old, or fully vaccinated if they are 18 years or older, unless an exception applies. In New South Wales, we're seeing it which applies by sector. Again, public health requirements, while they were ceased at the end of the 19th of June, there is still the requirements for New South Wales health staff to have at least 2 doses of the vaccine, and this continues to apply beyond the 19th of June. Again, if we look at Queensland, again, workers in healthcare, COVID-19 vaccination is no longer required for healthcare workers in primary care, private hospitals, private allied health services, but employers will be responsible for the management of the vaccine mandates in those settings. If we jump to WA, again, effective from 10th of June 2022, WA's mandatory vaccination policy will only apply to workforces working with the most vulnerable and protect them from disease. And they've listed these here as well too. What we are also seeing as well too, excuse me, and going into South Australia, is that again from the 24th of May, the South Australian Public Health Amendment Act was amended, so that was introduced, sorry, so that emergency powers could end. Emergency directions for mandatory vaccinations at SARPOL workers, education and early childhood workers and passenger transport have now been revoked. Now, essentially, what it does also say is that there are separate from the government mandated vaccination requirements for some employers who have implemented their own vaccination requirements. So now you are seeing quite clearly a pushback from government departments back onto your specific agencies. So, what does this mean? Well, essentially, it is still a requirement under work health and safety, and it is something that we flagged 6 months ago that this would essentially happen because we were seeing the trends in the laws that were actually pushing them back onto agencies. So essentially, you have clients, personnel, and people returning back to the office. We just had a office diagram that we've used in the past, but you get the idea. It is settings, whether you work in aged care, NDIS funded services, community services organisations, that essentially people are returning back to work, and there is the requirement that agencies like yourselves need to carefully consider what these obligations are. Now, from a governance point of view, I cannot stress this enough. When we talk of work health and safety, it is not just the work health and safety officer. You are essentially seeing this from the board of directors and anyone in a director or officer position will have the responsibility for overseeing these requirements. So essentially, when we talk of risk assessments, and you've seen it now with all the government agencies and departments of health around the country, pushing it back onto your agency. So what does this mean? Well, essentially what we have here is a risk assessment template. We have looked across the different states and territories, and they do talk about risk assessment templates. So what do we mean by this, and how does this work? Well, essentially the risk assessment template, if we work from left to right, what it is looking at is essentially who should actually be vaccinated within your agency, and what is reasonable in terms of actually managing the transmission of COVID within your workplace. Now, you may find that, especially in some community service organisations, that there are different staff that run different program areas. Or you might have an agency that's, I'm going to say, provides a single service. It might be in aged care, it might be in NDIS, or it might be in Aboriginal community controlled services. So the broad population group that you are delivering services to, the likelihood and risk of transmission is increased because you are providing those services to vulnerable population groups. And this essentially is covered within the template document that I mentioned before. So if I just bring that up again, let me just bring this up for you as well too. Essentially what you will see is the template document that you can utilize. And it, as I mentioned, here it is here. You've got the template document. It is a Word document, and you can start to use this straight away, really. So idea is that we've designed it as a work instruction. The work instruction document, rather than having a policy or procedure, can sit alongside, so that way a manager can essentially use it and it's ready to go. Now, someone's just asked, where does this document come from? How do we consider it as to be best practice? That's a great question. Let me just slide this across for you as well too. This is just an example of what we've seen with the Department of Health in Tassie, issued on the 13th of October. Essentially what we've done is actually look at whose responsibilities it is. This is just a sample of the Department of Health in Tassie. What are the employers' legal responsibilities? What is the risk assessment that you need to look at, and how do you actually manage that? And we've taken this document and essentially poured it, for a better word, into this work instruction directly for you. So you've got something ready to go straight off the shelf for you as well too. So how does this work? Well, essentially when we look at the risk assessment, what we're looking at is describe the risk of transmission. So in this case, it may well be that, let's say, a staff member is providing face-to-face services. So if they're providing face-to-face services, what does that mean? Well, then the likelihood of transmission is high. And we can see this from table A. What that then means is what is the consequence? And we get the consequence from table B. Oops, excuse me. So table B means that, well, it is a significant impact to your business if transmission was to occur. So essentially, we've got then a high risk. Now, the gross risk rating means that if I've got a high in table A and a high in table B, then we can have a look at table C, and I've got high, and that gives me a high risk rating on this table here. What it then asks you is what is the mitigating control? So the mitigating controls obviously is that you provide still social distancing, which you would just standardly have in place. You would also ask people to wear face masks. Now, obviously, some of those controls would prevent some reasonable way to prevent transmission. Now, let's reassess this based on the likelihood. Now, again, if I had a person that was COVID positive and I was providing services to a vulnerable population, would that be enough? Well, the likelihood risk again would mean that, well, I would still end up with high and high. Now, I want to actually minimize this to what is reasonable. So by minimizing this to what is reasonable, I really want to say, well, in this case, we do require people to be vaccinated because that would be the most reasonable step for people to continue to work in this space. So if we do that, then essentially I've lowered my risk to low and low because I've also got this done. It means then that the reassessment and the net risk assessment again too is now low. So essentially from this table here, what I'm able to do is minimize my risk or quantify it based on what I need to see from here. Now, in saying that, obviously it is a simple way of actually doing it, but it is something that we've actually taken from the Department of Health and we've seen it work. So essentially, when you're talking of risk assessments within your agency, this is what we are talking about here, and this is how you can minimize your work health and safety obligations. Of course, as part of this, it means that you're able to meet all your obligations of it. More than happy to stay online and answer any questions that you might have. We do suggest you look at all of these risk assessments and have a look at the templates coming out. If you do have any questions, then certainly reach out to us. We're more than happy to field those online, and you can access us by simply going, if I bring this up, into your Gemba dashboard. You will find that quite simply by logging in, you can have access to our chat group. And if I did want to chat now, here we are here, I can bring this up for you to view as well too. So you can see that essentially directly from here. Alternatively, if you did have any questions, you can email us directly at support@gemba360.com, or you can phone us on the 1300 360 360 number.